Okay, let's start our discussion of the patriarchs. And every now and then I have a deep thought picture that talks about the book of each of the books of the Old Testament. This is the big N-ning, which is the theme of Genesis 1 through 11. But for the purposes of today, we're going to talk about the patriarchs. And as we've said all along, the basic location for all of the events in Genesis 1 through 11 have taken place in the Mesopotamian area here, Tigris-Euphrates River Valley. What's important to know is that God is going to bring the history from this area, and in the journeys of Abraham, bring it around to this area here, all the area around here called the Promised Land. So it's going to be the new location from this land to this land. And as I've already pointed out previously, we're talking about now, we're down to this dynastic period. And what's interesting in terms of background information, all of the activity going on in and around the Mesopotamian area in Abraham's hometown of Ur, and the high development, the Renaissance of revival in art, literature, and law, highly developed writing, and all of these things going on in and around 2000 BC, which is our historical setting for Abraham and his journeys with his father in the household of Terah. So of all the big lessons that we've learned from Genesis 1 through 11, those big theological lessons we talked about, Yahweh as king, the idea of him establishing his rule or his order over the entire creation, but he's extending to human beings, that is, the image of God bearers, some of the responsibility for certain commands that reflect God himself, the image of ruling and subduing, filling and multiplying. But what we find is in Genesis 3 that humanity has rebelled against that image of God bearing responsibility. So what's happening next is Yahweh's going to extend the benefits of relationship through this idea called a covenant, the idea of a covenant relationship, which is going to be a new concept that we're going to find that shows up in the pages of Scripture, part and parcel here with Abraham. Covenants were obviously popular and well known in the ancient world. They were the format that kings would use to communicate one to another and establish relationship. These go back to here, pictured here is an ancient Hittite document on stone tablets. Of course, Moses comes off of Mount Sinai with 2 tablets of stone, one copy for himself and one copy for the people. And the relationship that we're talking about here is this, what's called the suzerain-vassal relationship in the ancient world. Suzerain being the big king, and the vassal being the lesser king. And these kings would write to each other in ancient treaty documents, and they would write and correspond one to another once the relationship was established. And you'd have interesting language show up. You'd have words like love or I love you, king, not to be focusing on this inappropriate relationship or anything. Love meant loyalty in the ancient world. So you'd have lesser kings calling the superior king father, and the superior king in the relationship calling the lesser king's son. You are my son. So these were family terms, and they were used to convey the essence of covenant relationship. So if we take author and audience seriously, what we have, Moses is the author, and he's recounting the Abrahamic history to Israel, his audience. But the primary lesson that we want to see in Abraham is the idea of the covenant relationship that was established. It was Mount Sinai where Israel as a nation had the encounter with Yahweh, were introduced to Yahweh by name, and were invited into covenant relationship. So here this picture is the idea of baton. We're going to see in the patriarchal history, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, how this baton of covenant relationship is passed on from one patriarch to the next. And here I just throw in a few extra pictures. This is Abraham's hometown of Ur, just to continue the side conversation of archaeology. Abraham walked these streets with a six string on his back, no pun intended. This is his hometown. And next we have ancient Haran. This is where Terah dies, the end of chapter 11. And this is where I would argue Abraham is going to pick up the baton of household leadership after his father passes away. This would have been where Abraham receives his call to respond to God's invitation. What's interesting about this time period, just to give you a little background information, and this comes right out of the text of Scripture. If we fast forward to Joshua, in Joshua chapter 24, he's giving a historical overview or review for his audience, and he refers to this in verse 2. Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, from ancient times your fathers lived beyond the river," that's the Tigris Euphrates, "namely Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods." So really what we've got here is Abraham the beginning part of his journey with the Lord is that he's coming out of this lifestyle or this culture of multiple gods, and he's being introduced to the idea of following the one true God. So this is what we see in the beginning stages of Abraham, and I think he's probably a pretty quick understudy with regards to what it means to follow the one true God, because soon after his call in Genesis chapter 12, we have the verse that reminds us that he begins to call on the name Yahweh as an expression of worship and allegiance. So you can look at the text of Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3 down through 4, maybe verse 5 as well, and you can see that the elements of what God or Yahweh is going to promise to Abraham and his household. Abraham's household would become a great nation. Abraham's household or clan would be blessed by the king, and the king would establish his name by establishing Abraham's name among the nations in the land. But there's going to be problems, and part of in the Abraham narrative, we run up against these conflicts. The Canaanites are going to offer some pushback because they're already in the land. There's going to be famine. That's going to be a threat to the household of Abraham. There's going to be conflicts with opposing nations, namely Egypt. So this is going to be part of the Abrahamic struggle, Abraham's struggle over the faithful follow-through to the covenant call. Of course, the issue of him becoming a great nation is going to be the primary conflict with regards to the fact that it's a while before Abraham and Sarah, his wife, have their son. Of course, they're going to need a son, and many sons perhaps, to from them emerge a great nation. And we see that conflict right away in Genesis chapter 15, verses 1 through 21. And this is just a quick overview. I'll let you look at that yourself, but you see here in this account that Abraham's struggling. He's having a faith crisis. And it's interesting that the faith development of the patriarchs or any of the faithful is God's primary concern. Sometimes that happens through conflict and difficulty. Oftentimes it does. So I love this passage, and when Abraham is doubting the most, and he's here attempting with Eliezer, trying to come up with this alternative plan B, God says, go out and start counting the stars. And on a personal note, if you've ever had that encounter of going out under the night sky in some of the darkest parts of Texas, I like to go out to the Davis Mountains and go out to the McDonald Observatory when I'm out there scuba diving at Balmorhea State Park. And it's just amazing to be out in the night sky. You see the band of the Milky Way, and you can look through a telescope and see the Andromeda Galaxy, and it's just counting stars. We're still counting stars, by the way, 1 times 10 to the 21st stars that we are estimating in the known universe that we're able to observe. So it just seems like God has a way of knowing how to encourage us when we have our faith struggles, and here Abraham is encouraged. And in verse 6, he believes in Yahweh, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And that verse is huge because, as you know, down the road, for the writers of the New Testament, namely Paul and the author of Hebrews and others, I think James as well, there's going to be New Testament authors picking up on the fact that, look, when was justification by faith firmly rooted in the equation of salvation? Was it before or after Sinai, when the expectations for obedience would take place through the teachings of the commands, the beginnings of the Torah? Well, it happened before. Abraham is credited as righteous by his faith before he's even gotten to Mount Sinai, so to speak. Israel's going to get there later. So if you put the cart before the horse, what you have is legalism. And that was the problem of the first century church when the cart before the horse, namely the expectations for obedience took place before the expectations for a heart change or a heart transformation. So here Abraham is merely responding to the basic commands of follow me from the Lord, and he does. Trust me was the basic command here. And Abraham responds, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So that's Paul's point in the New Testament. So for all you New Testament geeks out there, this is an important point to make at this stage. Now we won't cover these in great detail, but I want to make you aware of there's conflicts that come along, or you might say threats to the promise of seed to Abraham. And this first one's going to be here in Genesis 20. This one's going to be caused by the conflict with Abimelech. And what's interesting about this story is Abraham passing his wife Sarah off as his sister. Now we know from ancient documents and legal code that in that ancient world, a sister had a higher status than a wife. Now, granted, Abraham is not exactly being honest and truthful here, and it is a faith struggle, and he's not necessarily demonstrating full-out trust in the Lord. But we have to give him credit that he's being wise about his mini deception, in that he's passing Sarah off to be his sister, which would put her at a higher social status in the eyes of any pagan king. So that's a amplified way of protecting her all the more. So throw that into your interpretation just for free. Now the divinely caused episode that literally is the word here in chapter 22 verse 1, the idea of test. The idea of testing comes from, you'll hear me say in class or online here, a metallurgical idea. It comes from the idea of refining, or the refining of a precious metal like gold. So you heat the metal through, you might say, adversity, or making the flames hot, melting the metal and skimming off the impurities and discarding them, so what you have left behind is a pure form of the precious metal. So the testing idea comes from metallurgy, and it's used to describe the experience where God refines the faith of the faithful. And here we have testing going on in Genesis 22. I'll let you read that account on your own, but God is initiating the circumstances here. He's bringing Abraham through, you might say, the extreme difficult circumstance, the sacrificing of his son Isaac. So it's interesting what happens. There's a lot of clues here with regards to the fact that when the Lord tests his faithful, he never deserts them, and he provides a way out. And in this way, he provides the lamb at just the last minute. The messenger is sent to declare that Abraham is one who fears Yahweh, and the idea of fearing Yahweh is a way of describing someone who demonstrates their loyalty to God. Anyone who fears Yahweh is one who's perhaps gone through their own refining experience and have demonstrated loyalty before the Lord. So this is where that goes. Genesis 22 is perhaps the climax event with regards to Abraham's faith journey. So this is an interesting slide. I really like this slide because it's kind of a faith map for Abraham the patriarch. One of the things that you'll see, if you've ever really noticed this, is the patriarchs are presented warts and all, which I think adds some huge legitimacy to Moses the author, who is bringing these accounts into the life of Israel so that they see what a real authentic faith looks like. Well, it is 2 steps forward and 1 step back. it is when you fall down, you get up and brush yourself off. And you can see here, what we have is 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 3 steps forward, 1 step back, and you've got this huge dip, and eventually you get up here to the climax here in Genesis 22, and that's what the life, if you map out the life journey of Abraham, what it does model. But a gradual incline is what we see. And that's hopefully what we're seeing in our own life, in our own faith life. And that's what we're invited to do when we read the patriarchs, is we're invited to read them and understand and see ourselves in the lives of the patriarchs. Now, I won't go into this in too much detail, but you've got this Toledot formula. Toledot formula. This is the repeated phrase that you see. This is like, these are the generations of, beginning with the heavens and the earth in Genesis 2:4, and it basically goes through up to the next Toledot formula, and these are the generations of Adam. These are the generations of Noah. These are the generations of the sons of Adam. And then these are the generations of Terah, which go through the entire Abraham cycle. Then we've got the patriarchs, Ishmael, then we've got Isaac and Esau, and then down to Jacob. So like first level subheads that you'd use to organize the major sections of your 8 to 10 page research paper, that's how the book of Genesis is somewhat organized by the author Moses. So when we talk about the baton being passed, what I like to do is introduce a little bit of some humor here. And what we're going to have, the baton's going to be passed on to Jacob. And it's interesting that if you look at the life of Jacob, one of the big theological themes that emerges is this theme of deception. Like my dog at home, this little Welsh Corgi. But this dog, don't be deceived. This dog is a deceiver. There's the look that she gives when she looks at you and says, I want something. And you're kind of manipulated into thinking that there's little devil horns coming out of this dog. But this dog has influenced other members of my household, namely my daughter, who oftentimes gives me the teenager look of, Dad, I need something. Most commonly it's money, or I need to borrow the car, or something like that. She's a senior now. Anyway, but I'll let you look at the text of Genesis 27, 1 through 41, and read that. And the main characters, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Esau, develops the theme of Jacob the deceiver. All right, and Jacob's going to deceive his brother Esau out of the birthright, and also round 2, the blessing. And he is a deceiver in the early stages of his patriarchal career. However, one little point I want to show you is that if you look at like Genesis chapter 28, right at the end of Jacob's going to have a dream beginning in verse 10, and you're going to see that God is going to maintain his covenant promises to the patriarchs even despite themselves. And in the dream we have the recounting of, like verse 13, Yahweh stood above it and said, I am Yahweh, the God of your father Abraham, the God of Isaac. On the land which you lie, I will give it to you and to your descendants. Notice the repetition that we see from Abraham. Your descendants shall also be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south, and in you and your descendants, and shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So we have this renewing of the covenant promises from patriarch to patriarch to patriarch, but yet woven into the very fabric of this somewhat chaotic, the chaos and all of the dysfunction, you might say, of these families that represent the patriarchs. Now in chapter 29, verses really 13 down through verses 25, we have an interesting turn of events with Jacob, the deceiver, because here with Laban, he meets his future wife, Rachel, whose name means fair or beautiful, and the other daughter is Leah, and he loves Rachel. And through this turn of events, I'll let you read it on your own, but over in verses 21 and following, after a night of partying, we've got Jacob in his tent, and Laban comes in and replaces daughter Rachel with daughter Leah, and he wakes up in verse 25 and asks, "What is this you have done to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served you? Why have you deceived me?" So there's the theologically loaded question. Now the deceiver becomes the one who's deceived. And the humor here behind the text is that he wakes up next to Leah, whose name in Hebrew means cow. So there's some biblical humor there that's somewhat hidden in the text. So now the deceiver has been deceived. And we're going to have another transformative event over in chapter 32. And in verses 24 and following, we're going to have this, I call it the divine wrestling match, although I think he's probably wrestling with an angel. Or in the Hebrew, it's more an idea of a messenger of the Lord. It's not going to have wings per se, although that's in the picture, but someone who looks like a human or a man and who's representing the Lord and his agenda for that particular instant in time. And in this case, literally, the deceiver needs to be wrestled to the ground. And I think that this represents Jacob's transformation experience, such that in chapter 33, we have this very moving scene of two brothers, Jacob and Esau, coming together finally, reconciling their differences. I would argue that even Esau, although it's not in the text, had some kind of transformative experience, so that when they have their encounter there in verses 3 and 4, Esau runs to meet him and embraces him, and he falls on his neck and kisses him, and they wept together. Brothers reconciled. So here's the big idea theologically in between Jacob and Esau. It models to Israel, who's going into the promised land, and it's all about brothers getting along. Brothers need to get along, because if they get to the promised land and they're not getting along, you're going to have a failed experiment from the beginning. So Jacob and Esau, working through their differences, working through the grudge, so-called grudge, and all of that, finally illustrate and become an example for Israel in terms of tribes, the sons of Jacob who will emerge to be the tribes who settle in the land, those tribes getting along as well. Now this is going to set up for us the Joseph narrative, because the whole theme of brotherhood, the idea of brothers getting along, loyalty versus deception, is going to pick up in the Joseph narrative, because you're going to have 10 older brothers and you're going to have the younger brothers born to Rachel, that is Joseph himself, and then even a younger brother, Benjamin, born to Rachel. So you're going to have inner family sibling rivalry, jealousy, deception, and eventually we're going to get to this idea of fratricide, that is brother killing brother. And then through this whole thing comes this idea of refinement of loyalty and the idea of refinement of faith, trust, loyalty one to another, this idea of brotherhood in Joseph and his family. This is going to be the theological concern. However, the question mark of this baton being passed is really held in question in that chapter 34 and the events that take place. You're going to have some of Jacob's sons, and I'll let you read that on your own, chapter 34, 1 through 30. The sons of Jacob act deceitfully, and they're going to deceive the king of Shechem and his son, Hamor, and these the men of Shechem into this, and they're going to actually deceive, but then they're also going to the extreme with regards to murdering as an act of revenge. So that's a huge account, and it leaves a huge question mark in my mind of the position of loyalty or brotherhood that's going on with these 10 sons of Jacob. And this is all before we get to the Joseph narrative, and that's where we'll go now. So here I have in red on this slide the emphasis that I think becomes one of the theological themes of the Joseph narrative. Let me show you why I could not leave this group in the promised land, that is this group of 10, the 10 deceptive brothers of the sons of Jacob. They're going to be moved to Egypt, out of the land as somewhat of an exile, as a means of refining and coming up with another generation of brothers who could potentially enter the land. So just a little bit of a theological aside. You know, we've got genealogies that have taken us from Adam and Eve, and then to one of the sons, Seth, who I argue is part of that godly line, the godly line of Seth that gets us through, you know, the controversy over the Nephilim and through the flood narrative and to Tower of Babel, and then eventually to the sons of Noah. And then from Noah, we go down to the father of Abraham, Terah. Now, what we've seen here is hard to keep track of, but I've got this little chart here that shows you the patriarchal line, Abraham to Isaac, Isaac to Jacob, and then eventually Jacob to Joseph. And we've got the two wives of Jacob, the one whose name means cow, and then Rachel. She's going to have Joseph and Benjamin. Some of the sons are born by Leah, and some of the sons are born by two handmaids, Bilnah and Zilpah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. So it's kind of a complicated history, but there you have it. And now that takes us to perhaps the most famous patriarch of all, Donny Osmond. So we have the Joseph narrative here, and let's start in chapter 37. Verse 2, we have reference to the genealogy. There's the Toledot formula in verse 2. Joseph starts as a 17-year-old pasturing his flock while he was young, and he brings back a bad report about his brothers to Father Jacob. We might only expect a bad report at this stage with regards to these older brothers. We've already learned how deceptive they can be and how deceptive they are. And as you all probably know, in the Joseph narrative, you're familiar with this story. These brothers do exactly just that because of their jealousy over their younger brother. Of course, Jacob doesn't help by playing favorites, and he favors Joseph. There's the Technicolor Dreamcoat, no pun intended there, but these brothers plot to kill Joseph, and they eventually talk themselves out of it, but instead they sell him to Ishmaelite traders, which would have been as good as fratricide, leaving one brother behind to die, which would have been fratricide in that day, because brotherhood was where it was at. You were extremely called as a member of a household to demonstrate loyalty within that household. Anything but that would be less than, certainly leaving a brother behind would be abandoning a brother, would be as good as leaving him to die. And that's exactly what happens in the Joseph narrative. And we get to chapter 39, and in verses 1 through 3, we have Joseph in Egyptian prison or bondage, and an emphasis in those first three verses, three times repeated. We see it. The Lord was with Joseph in verse 2, caused him to be a successful man. Now his master saw that the Lord was with him, and how the Lord caused all that he did to become good and prosperous. Joseph found favor in verse 4 in his sight and became his personal servant. So the Lord is with Joseph. The Lord is with Joseph. The Lord is with Joseph. And it's this refining idea. I think for Joseph in Egypt, he's being refined. He's being transformed because the Lord is with him, guiding him through this very difficult circumstance. And as a result, Joseph is able to cultivate faith and trust in the Lord and experience this success. Because we have a minor setback there at the end of chapter 39, the conflict with Potiphar's wife. But then here again in verse 19 at the end of chapter 39, we see that the Lord was with Joseph. He extends kindness to him. He grants him favor. And then the chief jailer put Joseph in charge because the Lord was with him in whatever he did. Yahweh caused Joseph to prosper. Of course, Joseph's going to pick up another occupation of dream interpreter. And all of this together with the Lord's help is going to rise Joseph to that position of power in Egypt, so that he's literally at the right hand of Pharaoh himself with regards to famine relief efforts. Now, I'm trying to stay close to 30 minutes on this one, so I'll just be a little bit brief on this. But in chapter 42, we have and I'll let you read that chapter. We have the encounter of Joseph's brothers and Joseph, who's going to be disguised. Of course, probably about 20 years has passed, so Joseph's older. He's no longer a small, selfish brat. He's come out of the Egyptian experience. He's got all the power of the Egyptian army at his right hand. The brothers come And there's this exchange where Joseph's accusing them to be spies, and he's trying to test their words. The idea of testing there is a word that comes from that comes from that metallurgical background. More of the idea behind a touchstone. That is something that would authenticate the value or the value of a precious metal sample. In those days, they had these hard stones that they'd rub metal samples on, and they were able to determine by the streak of color left behind how valuable that gold nugget was. So here we have Joseph working as an extension of God himself to test the words of the brothers. Of course, they're all claiming to be they're all sons of one father. They're all a big band of brothers. We are all 12 brothers. And Joseph's saying, I'm testing your words, your claim to brotherhood, I think is what's being tested here, not his accusation of being spies. He knows they're not spies. What he wants to do is test to see if they're really a brotherhood. So you see, I'll let you read it on your own, but as you go through the narrative in this chapter 42, first of all, Simeon is going to be isolated and going to be left behind. And the brothers, first, all the brothers are going to be put in jail, with one of them going back to get little Ben, or the youngest brother, to bring him back. Then after 3 days, Joseph turns that around, and then Simeon is going to be the single brother left behind, and the other 9 are going to be sent back to get Benjamin. Of course, I don't think Joseph even knows if Benjamin's even alive or not. So what is he testing here? He's testing their brotherhood. He wants to know if, A, they'll leave behind another brother like they did with him, and B, he wants to know if they have treated his brother Benjamin the same way they treated him. So you'll see in my PowerPoint notes, I kind of give a little more detail, and I'll let you look at that on your own. But in chapter 43, I'd argue that there's an ambiguous delay. You've got another famine after they've eaten all the famine relief grain that Joseph had sent them home with from before. They've gotten to the end of the grain in their sacks. Time has passed. I think it's very obvious, and there's been inactivity on the account of these brothers. They've not done anything with regards to Simeon. He's still in the Egyptian jail. So far, we have these brothers who are demonstrating a general lack of brotherhood. They are basically, because of their inactivity, are doing the same thing that they did with their brother Joseph before. They're not demonstrating any loyalty at all. Otherwise, they would have gotten themselves together, convinced their dad, hey, it's time to act. We have to act now. Simeon's left behind, and they would have gone back and taken Benjamin and taken care of business, but they've not done that. So through chapter 43 and into chapter 44, we see that through the testing details, Joseph isolates Benjamin. Eventually, the focus gets on Benjamin. And Benjamin is going to be threatened to be left behind. But then finally we have some of the brothers starting to rise and speak up. So let's just kind of wrap this up. So we've got this conflict and this tension with regards to the brotherhood, and through this whole thing, Joseph's forcing these brothers into a similar scenario as was before to test them, or to, might say, try to refine them into doing the appropriate thing. And I don't think that really happens. Although Joseph maintains his activity of being kind and loyal to them, despite themselves and their return of loyalty to Joseph. So I think this thesis, or this theme, this theological theme, takes us all the way to the very end of the book of Genesis, where finally we have Jacob's death. The fathers passed away. And then in verse 15, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they say, and they ask this question amongst themselves, what if Joseph should bear a grudge against us and pay us back in full for all the wrong which we did to him? Well, this is a scene with brothers acting like they're not really brothers, because if they had really watched Joseph and taken it all in, they would recognize that Joseph's being loyal to them and he's not holding a grudge. So this is a picture of brothers who just don't get it. And then they put words in their dead father's mouth, this idea in verse 17, what Jacob probably never said, but they put words in his mouth. Please forgive, I beg you, the transgression of your brothers and their sin, for they did you wrong. Now please forgive the transgression of the servants of God, of your father. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Why did he weep? I think Joseph's weeping because he's seeing and recognizing in this group of brothers, they're not really acting like brothers. There's not a brotherhood. So this attempt that Joseph has kind of that's been woven in through the whole narrative has really not come to fruition. But finally Joseph speaks, and he captures I think the theological punchline of the whole book in verse 18. They fall down again, and there's a bowing idea of these brothers. We've seen it before as one of the big ideas. Joseph says to them in verse 19, do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. And I think that's a big idea, that God will work through the faithfulness and fidelity of the patriarchs and individuals, despite, you might say, the majority around who are acting unfaithfully. There's always going to be one whom God will work through, and it may be that person might just be alone, or might be or represent the minority. But God works for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive, and it's exactly the scenario that we see. So the transition from Genesis to Exodus totally rides on the back of Joseph remaining faithful to his family despite their infidelity that they return. And that's going to be a huge transitional element. Finally, we're going to have to wait 400 years of Egyptian bondage for the promise to Abraham that a nation would emerge. And then we have to wait for another patriarch, not patriarch, but another leader, Moses, who acts like a patriarch, only now he's dealing with an entire, not just a household, but he's dealing with an entire nation. So it's going to be Moses, the reluctant, we'll see next time, the reluctant leader who will pick up this baton from the patriarchal history. And we finished in 37 minutes. Not bad. I hope this has been enjoyable for you, and we'll pick up next time with Exodus and Leviticus.